I know I can speak on behalf of everybody at the Hill to say how thrilled we are to be here in Minneapolis. Thank you for joining us for the first installment of the Building the Dream series. Minneapolis will be our first stop on a 3-cities tour, and we can't think of a better place to kick things off. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, the National Association of Home Builders, for their sponsor of this morning's event. We can't thank you enough for your partnership and support. The Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area is thriving, but as people flock to the Twin Cities in search of economic opportunities and urban living, a shortage of affordable housing is pricing residents out of the possibility of owning a home and driving up the cost of rent. As leaders across the country search for forward-looking solutions to tackle these housing inequalities in their own backyards, many are looking to Minneapolis's 2040 plan, which makes Minneapolis the first major U.S. city to end single-family zoning as an ambitious solution towards a future of more equitable housing access. We're going to be hearing from state legislators, city officials, local housing experts, and community leaders this morning as we explore Minneapolis's housing inequalities and lay out a path forward for the city's housing market. Before we get started, a few quick housekeeping notes. In addition to our audience here at the Lumber Exchange, we are also live streaming on thehill.com as well as the Hill's Facebook page. Please keep your phones on silent throughout the duration of the program. However, we definitely encourage you to engage in the conversation on social media. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn at The Hill Events, and join us in the conversation using the hashtag #TheHillBuildingTheDream. We'll be taking questions from the audience throughout the duration of the program, so please be on the lookout for members with the handheld mics. Finally, you'll receive an electronic survey at the end of the program. We are always eager to hear how we can make our events more dynamic, and I encourage you to take a few moments to provide your feedback on today's program. With that, let's dive in. Please join me in welcoming Minority Leader Kurt Daudt. Mr. Daudt currently serves as Minority Leader of the Minnesota House of Representatives, where he is a representative of the constituents of District 31A.
Well, thank you, Leader Daudt, for being here. I wanted to start with sort of putting this housing crisis in context. We talk a lot about this in cities like Seattle and cities like San Francisco or Los Angeles or Washington, D.C., but we don't hear a lot about the Midwestern metros. So tell me about the situation in Minneapolis.
Sure. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be here and participate. It's an interesting issue, and it's something that's really important. We have, and I brought some statistics I want to run through quickly too to kind of demonstrate how important this issue is. I think we've taken a lot of really good steps from a public policy perspective to make some incremental change in the right direction, to make housing more affordable and to make, frankly, housing more accessible for more people. But we have a long ways to go, and I think the statistics, forgive me for using notes, but the statistics I think really tell a very interesting story. Right now in Minnesota, we have the worst homeownership inventory in the U.S. We're 51st if you include the District of Columbia. We have very few options for first-time home buyers, workforce buyers, immigrant community, and I think this should be something that tells us we absolutely have to do better. We're 41st worst in rental inventory in the country, and we're 48th in the homeownership equity gap. So while we've taken steps from a public policy perspective, I think an area where we really need to focus on, and during my 4 years as Speaker of the House, we did take some steps in the right direction to reduce the cost of new construction. But I think that's one of the biggest barriers. I've got statistics here about what it costs to actually build a home here compared to other cities, and the numbers are staggering. And it's because of kind of bureaucratic hoops that we make people jump through to actually build homes. I think the steps that have been taken in Minneapolis to change the zoning to allow for multi-unit structures all across the city, I think will be helpful in increasing the inventory. But the permitting costs and all of the things associated with building a new home make it really unaffordable. Now, we don't have the land costs that they do on the coasts, but we are the highest cost of home building between the coasts in the entire country. Cost of medium, building a new home, we're the highest in the country between the coasts, and I think those numbers are shocking. The same home by the same builder in Lakeville, Minnesota, if you built that same home in Wisconsin, it's $60,000 less, same floor plan, same builder, If you built that same home in Chicago, it's $85,000 less, and if you built that same home in Indianapolis, it's $130,000 less. Now that's obviously a higher end home, but it demonstrates the fact that we through our bureaucratic hoops have made it really expensive to build homes in this state.
Mm-hmm. And what are we going to see out of the legislature? As you set your priorities for next year, I mean, Minnesota is the only divided legislature in the country. As you set your priorities next year, is housing an area of bipartisan consensus?
I think that it is, and I give props to Governor Dayton and Governor Walz for recognizing this. I think everybody on a bipartisan basis understands that the cost of home ownership is a real crisis in our state. They've created committees and blue ribbon commissions to deal with this, and I think we really need to utilize those avenues as a way of kind of bringing forward these issues and really dealing with them. And I think we really have to have the goal of not only trying to change our zoning policies to promote building of the type of housing that we need for people, and we have a huge workforce housing issue out in greater Minnesota as well, but we also need to address the cost of what it costs to build a home, because I think we've got a long ways to go, and I think our policies actually kind of give us the opposite result that we want. I think we're encouraging people either not to build the type of housing that we want because of those costs, or we're encouraging them to build elsewhere. There's statistics about the cost of land. If we really want kind of more dense construction in our metro areas, the cost of land is the issue. I think it's Prior Lake, a lot in that particular city, or maybe a 1 acre parcel in that particular city can be $120,000. You get outside of the city, it's $21,000 an acre in Credit River Township, which is literally just a stone's throw. So we're encouraging people not to build in the cities, but to build outside. And so while we talk about having public policy to have more dense development in our cities, our market is actually encouraging the opposite. So, I mean, we need to wrap our head around those things and try to come up with public policy to change that. But my focus in the next legislative session, as it has been in the last few, will be to actually reduce some of those bureaucratic hoops that people have to jump through to build a home, and try to reduce and take some of the cost out of building a new home in this state.
Are there specific types of regulations that you'd like to see reduced?
Well, for instance, in other cities, if you have to get water or environmental permits, it's one permit in one agency. In this state, it's 5 agencies, and they each require a permit, and they each require engineering. That's an example of duplicity that we just simply don't need. But I suppose in the way that government operates, these agencies for self-preservation have lobbied to keep their agency with their finger in the pie, trying to get a piece of the action. But the reality is that doesn't promote the building of the kind of, and at the pace that we need for new home ownership to be where we want it to be.
Mm-hmm. What are the root causes of this? It sounds like there's a combination of government inertia coupled with a broader problem of a growing population that wants more out of fewer units.
I think we haven't really, I'm going to talk from a legislative standpoint, and I don't mean to speak for the cities or for the Met Council, but I think we haven't come up with a real comprehensive plan for dealing with all of these things. I think we saw bills in the last session introduced that basically would not allow a landlord to do a background check on a tenant. Well, what's the end result of that going to be? Now, while it may sound like we're really, from the heart's perspective, it may sound like we're really giving people an opportunity to own a home or not own a home, but rent a home who may not have been able to otherwise, or may have been rejected unfairly. But the reality is that's a very small percentage of people. And if landlords now decide, I'm not going to take the chance on renting to somebody that may trash my unit and damage it without the appropriate deposit or whatever, and they pull that rental unit off the market, we've made it more difficult. And I already gave you a statistic that we're 51st worst rental inventory in the country. a policy like that, I think, will make the problem worse. So while it might feel good to your heart, our brain should tell us that this is going to give us the opposite result that we want.
You touched a little bit on the differences in prices between cities and suburbs and ex-urban areas, and the urban-rural divide is really dominating our politics right now. How does that play out? What are those tensions like in housing policy?
Well, that's a good question. I come from a rural area. I represent a district that's an hour north of the Twin Cities. I've been a little critical recently of our mayor, who I think is coming today, about the public safety aspect of the city. We've had some really high crime rates or high instances of very visible crimes during broad daylight, which we think prevents people from my district from coming in or dissuades them from coming in and participating in the economy of Minneapolis and St. Paul. I think from a housing perspective, it's also somewhat true. I think there's a competition for the dollars for workforce housing and for low-income housing. Some of our rural communities are struggling to keep and attract businesses because we don't have the workforce housing necessary to house the employees that would be required. And there is a competition that sets up. So when you have this urban-rural divide, in the legislature, just kind of generally that you see, and it's happening here just like it's happening all around the country, those sorts of issues kind of magnify that as well. But the housing issue is not just an issue for the metro area. But I think we as a state need to come together as a legislature and come up with our own plan of where we want to see development, where we want to see that sort of growth. Obviously, we have the infrastructure in the metro areas to grow further, but the problem is I think a lot of our policies are kind of almost encouraging a sprawl, and I think those are the sorts of issues we need to talk about.
Yeah, the balance there between the $120,000 for an acre in one place and $21,000 for the other, that does seem to encourage sprawl. Is sprawl by necessity a bad thing?
Not necessarily. There are people that certainly want to have an acre or two or three and live in a semi-rural area. I see that in my area a lot. We also have people that, will buy a 2 or 3 or 4 acre parcel and they want to have a horse ranch on it. I think we need to really, in rural areas, we talk about those issues frequently, but I think the Met Council is trying to deal with some of this stuff, but I think unfortunately the policies sometimes aren't consistent with what I think we want the outcome to be, because I think we're thinking with our hearts instead of our brains, and we're doing a lot of things that have made building a home and owning a home more expensive, and the more expensive we make it, the more out of reach it is for more Minnesotans, and our goal should be the exact opposite of that. I really hate to read these statistics and how expensive it is to build a home here in Minnesota, and it's not just the land values. Yes, that's a part of it, but the land values in Chicago are certainly as high as they are here. This really is the bureaucratic cost of the hoops that we make people jump through to build a new home in this state.
And what kind of impacts does that have? You mentioned working class families and immigrant families especially. I mean, what does that do to the people who are striving for that American dream?
Well, I think I shouldn't say everybody, but I think the statistic is probably around 90% of Minnesotans want to own a home. And we need to make that as accessible as possible so that everybody can participate in that. I mean, home ownership is a phenomenal thing for a community, for safety of a community, for stability of a family, and really for a family even to build equity and to build some wealth. A home is a great opportunity to do that through rising appreciation. So I think we need to do everything we can to really strive to make that happen. When people don't have access to it, you see this kind of divide getting greater. We have one of the largest achievement gaps in the country, which means our low income and minority students aren't getting the same level of education as our middle income students. The further that divide, just in everything, in education, in housing, the further that divide is, I feel like the longer term it is, and the more difficult it is for us to overcome that. So we need to narrow that divide in every one of those places as much as we can.
Mm-hmm. You talked too about the rental availability here in the city and in the state. In the past, I mean, government has played a role in subsidizing new home construction and subsidizing big developers and addressing that inventory shortage. Does government still have a role to play in that?
I think so. I think we probably have to. I prefer to see that role as minimal as possible and let the market, kind of solve some of those problems. But we have artificially raised the market by making people jump through so many expensive hoops to build a home in this state. I heard a statistic recently that to just the last revision of the building code added $7,000 average to the cost of building a new home. Just the last revision added $7,000 to the cost. And it's stupid things like if you have an unfinished basement, they make you sheetrock the ceiling now as part of the building code. And by the way, if you want to finish that basement in the future, you have to rip that sheetrock out. And then where does that sheetrock go? I mean, it's just it's illogical. And so those are the sorts of things that we really, I think, need to address. We had a pretty high visibility battle here with our governor recently over putting sprinklers into a private home. The courts eventually threw that out. The governor was going to do it, the previous governor, not the current one, was going to do it through rulemaking and revising the building code to require homes over a certain square footage to have sprinkler systems, which doesn't add it adds a cost to a home when the data doesn't really show that's a problem. But the reality was special interest groups show up at the Capitol and they lobby. In that case, it was plumbers. They wanted the extra work of putting sprinkler systems in every home. Can you blame them? No, but should we let that drive our public policy, or should we let the fact that we want to strive to have a higher rate of home ownership and have more people owning homes in this state, should that drive our public policy? And I think the answer is really clear. Now, common sense won out on that one, but the courts had to step in to make that happen. But it's one small example. Yeah.
Let's turn to the audience now. Questions? Anybody here? Yes, ma'am, right over here. Do we have a microphone, or you can just shout, please? I guess we do have a microphone.
Millions of people watch. You talk about homeownership around new homes. Is there going to be a policy to save our beautiful older homes, not tear those down and put them in a landfill somewhere? Those are the affordable homes that new home buyers can get into, not the new homes. Okay?
What do you think?
Well, I hope so. I mean, we certainly want to see that, but the reality is, we're 51st. If you include DC in home ownership inventory. That's not new homes, that's not just exclusively new home construction, that's all homes. The reality is we just don't have enough homes. I think when you bring new stuff on, it's the existing inventory, the older homes that become the more affordable ones. But you need to have, and I've been talking a lot about new homes, you need to have those new homes come on to increase the number in the inventory so that people can step up maybe from an older home into a newer home at a higher price point, but then that vacates that older home and makes that available in the marketplace for somebody to get in at a more affordable rate. So I hope so. I hope that, and I think that's something you have to think about too with this new 2040 plan and what the city of Minneapolis has done changing and whether the public policy drives the outcome that we actually want or creates the outcome that we want. If you've changed the policy so that every lot now in the city of Minneapolis can be a multi-family home instead of just a single family home, is that going to do the opposite of what you just said, which I think is important, to have those older homes at an affordable level for people to get in as a first-time home buyer? Is that going to cause the market to tear down those older homes and build a duplex or a triplex or a quad on that lot because a homeowner, a landowner now, a landlord can create some additional revenue by having multi-units to rent on that? So those are the sorts of things we need to think about, the cause and effect of the decisions that we make in public policy. But I agree with you. I think those older homes are absolutely necessary.
I got time for one more. Anybody else?
Sorry, I talk too much. So.
It's all right. We like that.
Hi. Well, you talked about the Met Council a lot, and I was gonna. I know the area median income for this area, according to the Met Council, for affordable housing is that 60% of the area median income is generally the rule. But according to the Met Council, the area median income is $92,000, and that's for a family of 4, and that's their only. So 60% of that area median income, even a Minneapolis school teacher could not afford something affordable.
Yeah.
So that area median income, it's factoring extremely wealthy people as well as everybody. So in my eyes, that figure is really rigged. And if developers or even the city or the Met Council thinks that that's a rule for affordable housing, it's really not the rule. And that's, I think, a big problem why we have this jam.
Thanks.
Yeah. I don't, more of a comment than a question. I don't disagree with you. I think, that is an issue, but, from a policymaker's perspective, we need to just think about, from an affordability standpoint, are the homes in Minneapolis too expensive, whether it be a new home or whether we've put a policy in place that kind of encourages a landowner to tear down an existing home, which might be more affordable, and put up a duplex or more. And what we're finding is that people are moving further and further out into the suburbs to get the sort of home that they can afford. I come from an area in the state where I really think is the best example almost in the country of the boom and the bust of the recession that we went through in, I'll say 2008, kind of the housing bubble. I was an Isanti County Commissioner prior to being in the legislature. Isanti County is the next county north of the 7-county metro area. We were at times the fastest growing county in the country prior to the recession, which means we had literally the highest, on a percentage basis, level of new home starts and those sorts of things. When the recession hits, we had the highest level of foreclosures, we really didn't see any new home construction for almost a decade to speak of. And so it really was the best example of a boom and a bust. And I think in addition to just the recession, one of the things that caused that is folks that live in my area. I'm a bedroom community. We're 45 minutes north of the metro area. And many of, I say, conservatively 100% of the people commute into the metro area to work. I'm joking, but it's not quite that high, but almost. And what happened too at that time was gas prices went to $4, from $2 a gallon to $4 a gallon, if you remember that. So when somebody had a budget of, $500 a month for gas, all of a sudden now it was $1,000 a month for gas to get to their job. And now they were having to make decisions. Do I put gas in my car today to get to my job, or do I pay my mortgage? And we saw the foreclosure rate go through the roof. So are we encouraging people through our home prices here in Minneapolis and the immediate kind of surrounding metro area, because we've made them so high through a lot of reasons, not just land costs, are we encouraging people to move out further and encouraging that urban sprawl? And did we kind of make that problem worse than it needed to be? I think the answer to that is yes, but it should be a really great lesson for us to learn.
All right, Minority Leader Kurt Dowd, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Dowd. Such a pleasure to have you here this morning. Next up, please join me in welcoming Representative Mohammed Noor. Mr. Noor represents District 60B and is serving his first term in the Minnesota House of Representatives. He is the Vice Chair of the Jobs and Economic Development Finance Division. Representative Noor, welcome.
Thank you.
So great to have you with us this morning. Joining Representative on stage is the Hill Senior Editor-at-Large, Steve Clemens. Steve, take it away.
Hey everybody, good morning. Happy Monday. We should start a club and show up here every Monday morning. I'm sure you'll all love that. Thank you for welcoming the Hill to your neighborhood. This is one of the first programs that we've done outside the Washington area. I'm sure you click on our news items and whatnot that we do, but I'm very pleased that we're out here today in person. And I'm glad to meet you. And I just have to say, I really enjoyed reading about you I was just telling you in the green room and kind of laughing. You've been running for office and you ran around against Ilhan Omar, you ran against all these people, and you've won now. And so I just want to start out, where do you hope where's your next post you're running for?
Well, I'm in the right place at the right timing, so I'm in a good place. We need to be in the House, so we need to be addressing some of the issues that we'll be talking about today. I think I'm comfortable where I am today, and I'll continue to do that work.
But what impressed me in looking at the profile, both of what you've been looking at renters' rights, you've been looking at various communities that are underserved and have been left out of some of the access points in this. I've been reading about you in the opioid crisis and various things that you have thought were priorities. But what is, just before we get into the hard issues about the affordability crisis in housing, what's driving you to play the role as a representative that you're doing?
Quite frankly, Representative Dowd just talked about the crisis that we have. We've got disparities in any given level, from education to housing to healthcare to employment and jobs and so many other things. We haven't been able to close those gaps, those opportunity gaps and the achievement gaps continue to persist. We are not finding the right solutions because we are avoiding them. People are trying to look for other people and say that's their problem. It's not. We haven't opened the doors for individuals to succeed and be able to feel that they belong. So that's something which actually drives me every single day to continue the fight that I'm fighting.
So we're here largely talking about housing, affordable housing, the mix of what's coming online. Kurt Dowd gave some data that I was unaware of. I did not know that the housing situation was as tight. I mean, 51st in the nation is something to take note of. If you had more power and resources to push three parts of that picture, what would you do to solve it? Because I think sometimes that's clarifying.
We do have an emergency when it comes to housing in Minnesota. The income rates are very low compared to what's happening in the rent and also affordability to buy a home. So we need to close that income gap that already exists. Fighting for $15 minimum wage is even lower than that because a rent for a one bedroom, if you look at the market rate, people will say it's $950. It's not. It's more than $950 when you come to Minneapolis. I could not afford to pay rent.
So is the answer more stock, or is the answer putting price caps, and that takes you down a different, takes you towards an economic management that some might call socialism, but I won't necessarily. But I mean, I think the broad question is, how do you bring more stock on to get prices down, or do you put price caps on?
Well, let's step back a little bit. I think we need to increase the minimum wage to something that is more affordable. For you to afford a one bedroom, you need to earn $19 an hour. We don't have those jobs. When you look at people of color and indigenous, they need to be earning at that level to afford one bedroom. So that income gap already needs to be addressed. The second piece, I think if things are not under control, we have to introduce rent control, which is really unfortunate that we will be stepping into that field. But when you look at the process that we have right now, we've got an emergency. People are paying more than 50% of their income into housing. They're not investing in their kids. They're not building their future. They don't have good education. They don't have good housing. Where are we going to go to? Because if you keep on pushing people out of the city, they'll keep on going outwards, and you end up having problems with those who are left out. And quite frankly, it's a crisis that we've created ourselves.
Do you sense, and I know this, we did a program the other day in Washington on veterans, and in this area, I checked that there are a great number of veterans who served this country in the same affordability crisis, paying more than half of their income today on rent. And so I guess my question is, I heard Kurt Dowd up here, but I also read that you were very disappointed in the last session that you thought these issues were not taken seriously. So for such a crisis, what do you need to happen on both sides of the aisle to get some constructive action?
So during the session, we were trying to get at least $150 million invested in housing, but we ended up getting $60 million. That was the only...
$60 million?
Yes, unfortunately. And quite frankly, we need to have a significant investment when it comes to the next session where we're talking about capital investment.
Right.
I think going to $500 million will be the right starting point, an investment so that we can have good public housing. We can start addressing homeownership significantly, because right now 350,000 home in Minneapolis is not something that I myself can afford to pay for. What about those who are in the lower income? What about those who are aspiring to own a home? What happened to the American dream when people are dreaming about housing, and yet we're hearing about public housing being grabbed by people who are wealthy and well-connected? So we need to disrupt that system and say, no, we can no longer let the system fail us, but we need to invest so that we can provide opportunities for everyone.
You know, I was impressed with the questions that were just posed to the minority leader about where things are done, landfill areas coming in. And a couple of years ago, I spent some time trying to understand the life of a home builder and the life of people moving in, and how you would do it from just the very detail of doing. And the minority leader up here made a comment. I don't think he meant that word, but he says there's a lot of duplicity in the system. I think what he meant is sort of duplicated replications, but we can call it duplicity. It was an interesting use of the word. But I guess the question is, if you look at it from the regulatory perspective of those that are out there, and I've kind of looked at, say, compare this zone to Oklahoma. Oklahoma, it's a lot easier to build a house or build homes in, I would call sort of mixed use spaces in Tulsa, Oklahoma versus Minneapolis. Is there any self-awareness within the city that perhaps they need to look at regulatory code and the costs that are attached, or the process? Because he raised it, and I'm just wondering if it's a legitimate issue.
Well, if regulation is in the way of getting more home ownership, we should get rid of it, because the fight is we need to start opening the doors for those who we have left them out. Whether you're low income, whether you're senior, we've got more veterans who are homeless. So if you look at the homeless and people, we hear about people who are sleeping in the transit system. We know we do have a problem, but we're a rich state. We could have actually provided everyone who's homeless a home, but we haven't invested the dollars that are required to start addressing those issues. So if there's the process or barriers that exist, it should not hinder the opportunity that everybody needs to have a home.
Mohammed, the other issue, I talked to the head of real estate nationally for PricewaterhouseCoopers, told him I was coming out here, and I said, what would be cool and interesting people hadn't thought about? And this man, Byron Carlock, said, what is happening today is that prices are so high, they've been driven high, and that the financial sector bears a lot more responsibility than either home builders or cities, that we've used to look at home ownership as the backbone to building a new middle class, but essentially we've given people lots of ways to take money out for whatever issue, but we've not given people the ability to kind of commingle their finances, to create intergenerational ownership between generations. I know you deal a lot with students, and you're very representative of those students that have been out there. Are there things that we should be looking at in the other part of the ecosystem that we're failing? Is it a blind spot?
Well, there are many blind spots when it comes to helping address the generational gap that exists when it comes to wealth building. I'll give you an example. In 2008, when we had the financial crisis, we put a lot of regulations in there. So many people who are able to afford to buy, now the barriers are in front of them. The banks are not willing to lend unless they have good secure information that this person will afford to pay. So the African American or black in the state, more than 30% own homes. Right now it's up to 20%. That's shame on us, because we haven't addressed that issue. We haven't looked into what other things are we creating by putting a lot of regulations that hold people back. So at least looking from that perspective, we need to start opening more doors. Maybe we need more co-ops. Maybe we need people to find other avenues, find venture capitalists who are going to invest in a process whereby makes affordability something more affordable. So right now, well, the rates have gone up, the prices have gone up. We're tapping people out of access to wealth building at all. So this is something I think we need to start having conversations about.
I want to go to the audience for a minute to give them an opportunity to share their thoughts and views. But, I'm a writer, storyteller, and in most stories, we like to have heroes and villains. Who are the villains in this story from your perspective?
I think the wealthy and well-connected folks have taken advantage of people who are unable to really afford their lives. Students cannot afford to pay their rents. The people of color, indigenous, have not been given the opportunity. And politicians like myself and others haven't done the right work to increase more home ownership, more affordable housing, significantly investing in something that people can feel they live in a good home and be able to afford their lives. That's something I think we can all collectively come together and do that.
I'm going to stick one more question, and then did you have your hand up? No. Okay. We'll get some other questions out here, but I want to ask, but there's a difference between a house and home, and just when you said that, I could sort of feel that you share this view that a home is where you feel safe, a home is where you feel connected, a home is part of a community, and I've been worried, many of us have been in this sort of new digital age, worried about whether community is surviving, and I'm interested in your views of this area in general, but as you think about your role in trying to promote, are there things that we're not doing to kind of remind people of the significance of community? That means empathy, that means working with each other, that means helping each other.
Absolutely. I think we walked away from the moral perspective in terms of what is our moral obligation to help those who need the most. In Minneapolis, we had the encampment. That's a face of what we have right now. And so we have to look at the continuum from homelessness to home ownership. Where are the gaps? How can we get somebody who never had an opportunity to own a home, who was homeless, to now say that I can own a home, they have got a good job, they can raise their family, they can afford their lives, they can pay for healthcare, they can pay for food, they can survive in a good environment. We can also start addressing safety issues, we can start addressing the education gaps that exist. But you have to start from somewhere. Without a roof over your head, without having a good job, then we are leaving people behind. And significantly, when you look at that, it goes mostly to the people of color, indigenous, who are mostly impacted. So we need to take our resources where we can have a significant impact. We need to start looking at equity. Many people don't understand what equity means. It's helping those who need the most, but not taking away from those who need at the same time. So we have to structurally, fundamentally shift to something that is more transformational when it comes to housing and home ownership.
Thank you so much for that. Let me open up the floor to folks here. Yes, right here in the... Katie, did I mess it up? Everyone, this is Katie Garner, who's running this around.
Thank you,
Sorry.
Representative Noor. I really appreciate what you're saying this morning. You brought up the topic of public housing. Can you talk about how public housing is underpinning the crisis, and can you speak to the need to invest further in public housing?
Thank you for the question. The issue of public housing is well known. Right now, we don't have enough stock of public housing. Federal government walked away from investing in public housing, and the state has not invested in public housing. So that gap has already created a big issue of waiting list. Many people who want to live in a public housing will have to wait for many, many years.
Do you know what the financial gap is, just so we have a fix on that?
Well, it's significant. I think that we will have to have billions of dollars in order to address that issue. So I don't have the numbers, quite frankly, with me right now. But then at the same time, you have got people who want to go to the rental assistance demonstration, meaning that they're willing to go now to the private sector and say, look, we cannot afford to have public housing because we cannot maintain them. So we'll bring investors who will take the building and be able to keep it more affordable. So the question is, if the public housing can no longer pay, will that building go to a private sector who should not have had that opportunity? So we have to look at how can we address that issue and provide assurance to the individuals that they're not going to be kicked out. Because what that will do is, instead of you living in a public housing, you now have Section 8 voucher to live in your building, and that creates a mess because people are not guaranteed and to have the same security that you have in living in a public housing. So we've got a problem, we need to address it collectively.
Yes, right here. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, that is my question then. Do you support privatizing or selling off public housing to private investors? And do you trust that they will actually stay public housing, that there is a protection for people in public housing if it is sold off to private?
So let me restate this for the video. You're asking, does Mohammed Noor support selling off public housing, and does he trust the mission, which is to provide public housing, to remain in place? Is that a fair? Okay, great.
So the private sector has already failed us in terms of creating that affordable housing. And personally, I'm going to be opposed in a way that privatization is the right solution. Public housing should remain public housing. It should help those who are veterans, those who are seniors who cannot even afford their lives. They should also provide an opportunity for those who are low income to be able to have a place to call home, a place where they can, at the end of the day, they can go relax and enjoy with their family. So quite frankly, I'm opposed to public housing going to privatization.
Just real quick before we close, are you supportive of Minneapolis 2040?
Absolutely. We need to create more housing.
What
but
do you
we
think
also
is the best part of it? Because I'm still learning about it. Tell me what the biggest zinger is in it.
The key issue right now is we need to start opening more spaces to have people to build a home. Right now, we've got families like me. If I wanted to create more opportunity in my own district, which is the highest home renters, we've got more than 90% home renters if you look at the numbers, because I've got students, immigrants, and people who have been moving out and renting to folks a small home where I can build more individuals so my extended family can live with me, will provide me an opportunity. People with large families, we're looking at the future, but we also need to be more cognizant. We're not going to be extend so that people cannot afford it. So we have to have that affordability in the mixture.
Well, I look forward to interviewing you at your next political job and your next political job.
I appreciate it.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mohammed Noor,
Thank you.
Representative, thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you, Rep. Noor. It is now time of the portion of the program produced by our underwriters, the National Association of Home Builders. Please welcome to the stage Greg Ugaldi, Chairman of the National Association of Home Builders. Joining Greg on stage is Deborah Meyerson, Principal of Meyerson Planning and Development Consulting. Deborah and Greg, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. So I'm Greg Ugaldi, Chairman of the National Association of Home Builders, and we've teamed up with The Hill to bring this series of town halls to discuss and address housing affordability issues around the country. So I'd like to give special thanks to The Hill for working with us and our NAHB team for pulling this together, and quite the audience. Thank you all, government officials, for working with us today, those here, those watching around the country, and listening to all these thoughts, ideas, and hopefully how we're going to address the issues down the road. We have a tremendous amount of stakeholders that have interest in this. Home builders, developers, and remodelers around the country, those in the rental space, and we have a lot of things that are adding to the cost of homes over time, and we're going to talk about those a little bit today. So I have Deborah Meyerson, who is the author and researcher of a book called How Did They Do It? It's a comprehensive review of different strategies that have worked around the country and some of the things that she's learned. So I'll turn it to Deborah and ask her, so what are some of the things that you've seen that are trending and really working and helping us out in these issues?
Well, Greg, some of the issues that we see that we've heard about from Minneapolis today are really not unique to the Twin Cities. It's really something that we see across the country. One of the issues is housing supply, which is really low in many markets compared to demand, and that of course is escalating housing prices. And so in response to that, we're seeing more of a push towards diversity of housing types. So missing middle housing has been a popular topic to get to housing types that are not high density multifamily and not purely detached single family, but looking at duplexes, triplexes, accessory dwelling units, attached row houses, all a mix of housing that we really need to be able to address the variety of demographic and affordability needs that are at stake right now.
Interesting. And, you know, a lot of those addressing density and things like that, right? So if we could control the land portion of a price, that helps drive costs down, as well as gives us more on the supply side.
Absolutely. And so there's different ways to do that. For example, at Daybreak, which is a master plan community in the South Jordan, Utah, it's a huge development, but one that they've really sought to get that mix of housing types in there so that it's really addressing the different needs that exist. But other needs are part of that, of really bringing in where local government comes in. Local governments have their responsibility to help make it possible to add to that housing supply, and that starts with a housing plan. Certainly, again, you have that locally, but that's the first place that communities need to start thinking to figure out what their needs are, what their target is, how many do you need, and how are you going to get there, and really to map that out. And then looking at the zoning and building codes. How do you, once you've identified how you're going to increase the supply and achieving that, again, innovative, creative approach to housing, have to make sure you can actually build it. And so that's what we're seeing, the experimentation and looking at how to revise codes are often updated more than every 15 or 20 years. And you need current codes to be able to reflect current needs.
It's so interesting because we put a lot of time and effort into the codes process and making sure that we are addressing needs as far as resiliency and energy efficiency, those types of things. But we also have stats that really show us how rent controls, for example, aren't really an answer that the government can put forward and show where it does help and work. It really adds to the cost of needed housing in the long haul. Are there any other things that you've seen that governments have brought up, or anything else that you want to cover?
Well, there's things that other local governments can also do to support housing supply. That might be whether it's investing in infrastructure or sometimes land donation, fee waivers. Those are all ways to lower that cost of housing, because one of the issues is the cost of building new construction. I've heard some conversation earlier about existing older housing versus new construction. We need both, right? Because the older housing is going to be affordable. You can't build older housing, and older housing is what has inherent affordability that's important, but you still need to add to that supply, and that's really important as well.
Right.
I think the flexibility and ability to modify is important. Sometimes if you get too locked into this is how it has to get built, this is how it has to get done, that creates some risks because it makes it harder for builders to be able to really meet the market needs where they are.
It's interesting. So, as we look at this, where do you think it's taking us? Where are we headed over the next few years to address the cost of housing affordability?
Absolutely. Some of what we need to think about is being more innovative in the housing types that we have. If we just keep doing what we've done in the past, we get to where we are right now. And so some of the examples that I've seen coming out are things like co-living. I've seen that it's in various markets in the country. I was looking recently at an example in Atlanta, and that's where people may have their own private living space, but other shared amenities, whether it might be shared cooking space, shared living space, as well as their own private space. And it's a way to create more opportunities for people to live in a compact area to lower housing costs, and that's an important innovation there. Smaller homes can do that as well, and there's just important to be able to think more creatively and then to have the public policy that can help support the construction of those housing types.
Yeah, multi-generational is a huge area that we're seeing increased development as well. Being able to have all different groups living under one roof, and when we fall short on the supply side, people fill in how it's needed, and we've come up with quite a few creative solutions to that as well.
What do you see as some of the construction trends of where that's going? It seems like something that's an important consideration.
One of the things that we have in the forefront, so the main issue for me this year as chairman has been housing affordability, and it will be with Dean Mond's chairmanship next year, housing affordability right into the election cycle. It's that critical and that important. When we're working with HUD and we hear that 25% of a purchase price of any home has been added due to regulatory compliance, all different areas of that. On average around the country, some areas are even much higher than that, but that's a serious concern. And one of the other stats that they use is the fact that over the last 15 years, the average age of a first-time buyer has increased by 5 years. So instead of being 25, 26 years old, we're up to 30, 31. It changes the whole dynamic of the American dream and the things that we strive for. The ability to be able to start your family, have rentals that work, and I think, Deborah, you're going to need the mic here. So when we look at that over time, it's really important that we're looking at the ability for people, everybody, all surveys show that you still strive toward home ownership, and that being the American dream that's at the forefront of establishing your existence in a community, your personal wealth, as well as the education of your family and so on. So, I mean, why don't you just wrap up with some of those thoughts?
Absolutely. I think that what you're describing is really important. I've also seen a lot of concern about just the cost of labor being a consideration, so that's going to be a continued need to work in that direction to make sure we have people going into the trades, because again, lowering the cost of housing is about partly increasing supply, but making the cost of building that housing as efficient as it can be as well. And so those are some important elements that we really need to consider. So getting to the missing middle housing, making local governments really plugged into where they need to be with housing planning, loosening up zoning codes, and making it accessible to build the supply that we need.
Good. And our Home Builders Institute and our National Endowment are helping with that workforce development piece and getting some curriculum into high schools and our ability to educate people, bring them right into our industry. We're working with veterans and a lot of others and welcoming. As we sit here today, we have 379,000 job openings in our industry. It's critical that we start addressing that need as well.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss that with you today.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you, Greg and Deborah, for we appreciate your support and for the insightful conversation this morning. It is now my pleasure to introduce a familiar face, Jacob Frye, the mayor of Minneapolis. Since his election in 2017, Mayor Frye has made addressing Minneapolis' affordable housing crisis his top priority. In his first year, he successfully advocated for a record-setting $40 million investment in the city's affordable housing efforts, signed a landmark comprehensive plan into law, and fast-tracked his Stable Homes, Stable Housing initiatives. Mr. Mayor, welcome.
Thank you.
And another familiar face, Lisa Bender, president of the Minneapolis City Council. Since her first election in 2013, Ms. Bender led the recent City Council adoption of the Minneapolis 2040 Plan, authorized the city's inclusionary zoning policy and the city's accessory dwelling unit ordinance. Council President Bender, great to have you with us. And Steve Clemens.
I've been told to take this away from you.
There we go.
I'm going to give it 2 mics. There you go. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. We have been talking about housing all morning, affordable housing, how to change the curve that Minneapolis is on, because we just heard from the minority leader in the Minnesota House about the state being 51st in the nation when it comes to this problem. So let me just start out. Mr. Mayor, what are you doing to fix it?
Well, we collectively are doing a whole lot. When you look at the affordable housing crisis, generally I divide it into two different subparts to fix it. The first is subsidy, bridging that gap between whatever constitutes the market rate and the affordable rate. We're doing a whole lot there. In fact, we've invested record amounts, 3 times the previous record, in affordable housing to the tune of $40 million, with a real focus on low-income housing and housing for people that are experiencing homelessness. And it's not just the focus on the subsidy, it's also making sure that we have affordable housing in every corner, in every neighborhood of our city. And we're making a big push for that. And in fact, just recently, the council allocated $18 million to 12 different projects throughout the city. And so we're stepping up to make sure that we're doing our part.
So before I jump over to Lisa, is that enough? Do you have enough resources? Mohammed Noor was just up here saying they were in the last state session trying to get 150 million, got something like 60 million. He said this is not yet moving with the resources it needs, but you sound happy with the resources you have.
No, we don't have anywhere close to enough funding. The $40 million was city money. Now, it used to be, if you go back to the 1980s, that we used to get significant federal funds to do affordable housing, significant federal funds to do public housing. Those funds have largely dried up, whether that's low-income tax credits or community development block grants. Those funds have dried up, and we at city levels have been, when you push it under the rug, like the controversy and the difficulty and the funding, we're what's under the rug. And we've had to pick up the slack in a big way. And, thankfully we are, but we need partners at both the state and federal legislature as well.
Lisa, what's your dashboard on this? And I know that you've been leading on the Minneapolis 2040 project. But what, let me just make it tough for you for a minute. What are you failing at right now that you have to get right?
Yeah, I mean, I think collectively across the country, we need to radically rethink housing as public infrastructure. We collectively, private and public sectors, provide transportation systems, we provide energy systems, we provide water systems, and housing has just been forgotten. And it's been both highly regulated in a way that benefits those with the most privilege and power, and it's also just forgotten in terms of public investment. The federal government walked away from public housing when I was a toddler. And so now, as a city council member, now in my early 40s, we've inherited a system that both, for decades has privileged those with the most and forgotten the people that we really have left behind. And housing is inextricably linked with income, with all these other systems that are failing, especially in Minnesota, people of color. As homelessness rises across the state, we have an eviction crisis, we have a rising homelessness crisis. Homelessness is up 10% statewide, even more in the metro. But the disparities that we see in race are striking. If you're a Native American person, you're 27% more likely to experience homelessness, as would be expected by the population. Black people are experiencing homelessness at 5 times more the rate, 27 times, 5 times more the rate as the population. And so when we talk about housing in Minnesota and Minneapolis, we have to talk about race as well.
I'm interested because you're both what I call, very high-level urban practitioners, right? You are thinking about how to run a city. Do you see other examples out there that are sort of your North Star? That I often do speak with mayors from all different parts of the country, and they have show and tell moments where you see something great happening in one area and they share it with another. But do you see anyone that you admire elsewhere in the nation that is getting the equities right and the balance between the private sector and the regulators and the different communities that you think would be a model for Minneapolis?
I think we're on the leading edge of a group of cities and states that are really combining loosening these regulations that, again, have really benefited folks with the most, and adding in layers of renter protections, looking at rent increase caps, looking at supporting legal protection for low-income renters. To me, they have to go hand in hand, and also looking at the income side. When you look at neighborhoods across the city of Minneapolis and you see, what neighborhoods are affordable to people by race, you see, over time, it has become less and less affordable, in part because housing costs have risen, but income has dropped so dramatically, especially for people of color in our community. And so that's why we raised the minimum wage locally, $15. Right. So I think, the cities of Philadelphia, New York City, California cities, the state of Oregon, with Portland really pushing and leading, we are all kind of working together, I would say. We talk all the time. Even folks, in Austin, which has heavy state preemption with a lot of things that we all want to do, we're talking with each other, and we're part of, I think, a cohort.
I was with the mayor of Seattle the other day, and she's struggling with the same sort of issues. But Mayor, you're North Stars in this?
Well, I think Council President is exactly right. There's a lot of camaraderie in cities right now because we have kind of become these laboratories of democracy where we're trying new things, we're thinking outside the box, and yes, we're pressing the envelope. And while there are kind of a menu of options that I look to other cities to check out, I gotta say, when I talk to other mayors throughout the country, they're envious of a lot of the work that we've done here. And whether that's around subsidy for affordable housing, the amount of money we're putting in, or that's around the comprehensive 2040 plan that we've been working on, or stable homes, stable schools, we have said from the very beginning that housing is a right, that everyone should have that safe place to go home to at the end of the night to rejuvenate for the next day. And we're putting our money where our mouth is on the topic.
Well, I know Stable Homes, Stable Schools is your marquee initiative in this area. Can you explain it to our? We have a lot of people watching online as well, but explain us to the building blocks of what you're doing with Stable Homes and Stable Schools.
I can. We recognize that around 7% of our Minneapolis public school age population is experiencing homelessness. An even higher percentage is seeing severe housing instability. So in other words, these kids are moving between schools twice and 3 times and more per year.
Can you give us a numeric, so 7% equals how many families roughly?
I mean, we're looking at thousands of kids, and that are experiencing homelessness or severe housing instability in some form. And so what we're doing is making sure that these kids have access to a stable home, hopefully within a certain radius of their school. Because I mean, like you hear about all the problems in the school, and you can't put it all on the teacher. These kids aren't walking into the classroom as a blank slate. They're coming in with all of the successes and failures of society, and so some of those failures we can help account for. And so what we're doing is stepping up to provide them that home, working with several different jurisdictions and our nonprofit community as well, and it's working. We already have over 500 kids that are presently in the program.
One of the areas, and I discussed it with Mohammed Noor, that I've been interested in is the area of regulation, which you talked about. You talked about regulation protecting rich people. What about just regulation in general? We had the minority leader, I think his name is Kurt Dowd, maybe I'm mispronouncing his name, up here and saying that there are a lot of duplicative efforts, that you've got to go through multiple places to get zoning permits and certain permits, and it's just not a rational process. And so a lot of the cost, I mean, one way to do this is you put a lot of money into homes and you want to put money into solving some of the public challenges in homes. The other side is just the ease of it in kind of looking at the regulatory dimension in terms of the costs and the barriers to actually providing, the kind of housing you want to have out there. Is there any kind of review you're doing of that element?
Compared with other cities, we actually have a relatively quick process for project approval. And frankly, because we have a state law that says within 60 days of an application, the city must act, and you can do one extension for a total of 120 days.
Right.
What's changing is that we used to have more of a kind of informal process before a project would submit its application, and that would be it would really depend on who's the council member or what neighborhood the project was in. And so I think one of the best things about Minneapolis 2040 in my mind is that because it has this new built form map, because it has very specific regulations citywide, it's creating more transparency, more fairness, and more predictability. So I think going along with that, and what you'll hear critics say, is that it's making it too easy to develop. So I think in order to really deliver on the other promises we've made to our community, that we're going to deliver affordable housing, that we're fighting climate change, through all these different actions, we are looking at ways to really, add inclusionary zoning, which will require affordable units in new projects. We're looking at green building standards. We're looking at how to leverage private investment for public transportation or transportation systems that we need to support that growth. And we are a bit limited by state law in a lot of those areas of how we might leverage private investment for the public good.
One of the things I've been, one of my personal obsessions is how do communities reinvent themselves. A few years ago, I came through Minneapolis with Steve Case. I don't know if many of you know Steve Case, the founder of America Online, and he's got something called Rise of the Rest. He took Mike Huckabee's old campaign bus and painted it, and he kind of took this bus around Midwest cities and went to startup zones, people that were doing startups. And so I rode on this bus for 5 days with Steve, and one of the places we're here and we saw this incredible market, I don't know where it is, somewhere in your city, of entrepreneurs from all over, many Somali entrepreneurs, and I think it's food and crafts and all sorts of stuff. But I guess one of the things I became interested in are how communities find that spark to reinvent themselves. Part of it is creating a lifestyle and space where innovators and young, next generation innovators want to be. And part of it is looking at some of the things that you were just talking about, the various dimensions. And the LEED folks that do LEED certification of buildings are now doing LEED communities. And that is like transportation, it's quality of life, it's inclusion, it's intergenerational, deals. Is there any of that going on in Minneapolis?
Yes, and actually that is a huge part of the 2040 plan. We are believers in beautiful socioeconomic and housing diversity in every corner of the city. We are believers that when you have 1,000 different backgrounds and mentalities and ideas at the table, or in your case, I'm assuming it was the Midtown Global Market that you went to.
Yes, yeah, it's so cool. I love that. I want to go there now.
It's spectacular. The food is amazing, the crafts, everything. But that's when great entrepreneurship takes place, and that's ultimately when our city is going to really rock. But in order to get that beautiful socioeconomic diversity throughout the city, you first have to allow for it. And for generations after generations, we didn't allow for it because we set a system up so that really, unless you were able to, build a very large home on a very large plot, you couldn't live in huge quadrants of the city. And so what the 2040 plan did and is doing is ensuring that we can have a housing diversity throughout the city. So not just single family homes, but duplexes or triplexes, and along commercial corridors we can get higher density to allow for, in some cases, affordable housing to go there. You know, will that necessarily mean that affordable housing will be there? No, but it allows for it, where previously, in many cases, was prevented.
Lisa, you seemed interested in the LEED part of this. Are you working with the LEED folks at all?
You know, we are working to try to create a new building code that would allow for much more stretching of green building requirements. This is a state law barrier. So in the interim, until we're able to change state law, we're looking at incentivizing green building features along the lines of LEED or other scoring.
And I'm interested, you know, when you're watching every single, data point in a city and kind of watching, I'm interested in what you pay most attention to see whether you're making progress. When do you see you're failing? Or Mike Rawlings, the mayor of Dallas, somebody I've interviewed a couple of times, and the first time I interviewed him, I sort of accidentally embarrassed him because I said, are you a data mayor? Do you have a dashboard and do you have an app for your city? It shows, Rahm Emanuel did, Mike Bloomberg did, Eric Garcetti in Los Angeles did, where if you could look at various features of the city, from crime to fires to whatever. So Mike Rawlings, the second time we interviewed him from Dallas, got a data, he had people to sign it, and then he showed me, he pulled out his notebook and said, here are all the issues. And the issue that was most important to him, he said, was real estate values in South Dallas. So he said if he saw real estate values in South Dallas rising, he knew he was doing his job, because he was getting the gravity to work differently, to embrace this community, look at it as a place to invest and to be in. So I'm interested in whether, one, are you folks driven by data, and what are the data that matter most as you're trying to succeed in this housing crisis?
Yeah, I think we're getting there with data. I mean,
you have a dashboard?
We have several dashboards.
Maybe next time we get together.
Dashboard. For me, I would say right now around housing, my biggest question is around residential displacement. The number of evictions we're seeing, the number of naturally occurring affordable housing units that we have and where they are, and how much rent is rising. That is what our community is feeling the most pressure around.
Mayor?
Well, I think we're experiencing the exact opposite dynamic as what you were explaining in Dallas, because when you have a neighborhood that is seeing underinvestment, you look to see the investment go and the values increase. Now we're seeing the exact opposite issue, whereas a whole lot of people want to live in Minneapolis right now. A whole lot of people want to live in and around the downtown core, and when you have demand that's sky high, but you don't have the supply to accommodate, the dynamic the council president just discussed starts happening, which is people begin getting displaced, and that is most definitely happening in our city.
Well, with Mohammed, maybe the data point is slowing rent increases, citizen. I mean, it may be in everything. Opportunity zones are also getting a lot of attention nationally now, and for those of you who don't know, this is was created in the Trump tax code that passed, and it allows very wealthy people to invest in what are considered to be distressed areas. But it's become very controversial that people are looking at this as sort of a giveaway to the rich, not achieving the purposes. How are opportunities zones going for the greater Minneapolis area?
I think the truth is we don't really know, because that program isn't a program per se, it's just an investment tool. And we had a map come to us very last minute. We made some changes. Frankly, I think the city of Minneapolis probably should have just said no, or maybe even more severely constricted the places where we said it was okay. Cities around the country don't have any tools to guide how opportunity investments happen, and so because we don't even know which projects have that funding or not, it's a financing tool, of course. So for us to be able to, leverage that investment in a way that stops displacement isn't possible.
So you're not a fan?
I'm not a fan.
You agree?
I think Council President's right. We don't know. The rules weren't gotten to us until very late in the game. We couldn't figure out exactly how the ownership structures would work. And if this is simply a matter of investing a whole lot of money, increasing the value, and displacing the people that made these corridors and neighborhoods wonderful to begin with, it's not a good strategy. Now we're trying to flip that whole dynamic on its head through a concept called cultural districts or cultural corridors, which is where we're directly investing in properties. We're allowing communities that are there to invest in the properties so that they can secure ownership and start building intergenerational wealth. And this is specifically geared towards communities of color.
I want to go to the audience just a minute, but with the last There's a gentleman over here who's got his hand up already, yay. But not yet, not yet. I was impressed in the preamble to what I read about Minneapolis 2040 in that you're very self-conscious and seem to be aware of the legacy of discrimination and of people because of ethnicity and race being left out. I remember Anthony Fox, who was the Secretary of Transportation, kind of gave me a lesson with various cities and looking at where, freeways went on and freeway off-ramps went on and how communities that were divided, and you reinforced this, patterns, often racial patterns. And we had, and you mentioned race. So I know that undoing that is a very big part of Minneapolis 2040, but it's one thing to say it and say that's a goal, it's another thing to do it. How do you really do it?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I don't think any city has really achieved this goal, right? And so for us, all of the support for Minneapolis 2040 came from our community. It came from housing advocates, for race justice advocates, for folks advocating for more sustainable and equitable transportation systems. So the way it will happen is the community will hold elected officials accountable over time.
Right.
And we have to be really careful. It's easier to change the zoning code to make it easier to develop housing than it is to figure out how to build community wealth in neighborhoods that have been disinvested for 100 years.
Right.
And so we have to make sure that before we do the deregulation part, before we make it easier to develop, that we are intentionally engaging our community, that we're creating the right tools. I think we just have to really hold ourselves accountable, and that will come from the
Jacob,
community.
do you have thoughts? Because you're from D.C. originally, so D.C. is also I think Mayor Bowser right now in Washington is doing a pretty phenomenal job, actually, from my perspective, of creating opportunities in parts that had been completely neglected and left out before. But I'm just sort of interested in how you actually, where you put the muscle to kind of undo some of these divides.
You first have to start looking at the history. And we have a history in Minneapolis where we literally have maps going back 100 of years that designate North Minneapolis as a slum for blacks and Jews. We then had restrictive covenants that ran with the land and intentional
The maps
segregation.
actually said that?
They did. And by the way, Minneapolis is not unique in that setup. There are cities throughout the country that have prescriptively segregated out communities, and once it became illegal through the Civil Rights Act to do some of those things explicitly, we then started doing it implicitly through a zoning code and through other forms of regulation. And so right now we're trying to make sure that the precision of our solutions now match the precision of the harm that was initially inflicted.
Thank you. Let me go to you. Yes, we have this gentleman right here. And then
Thank you. So I think we oftentimes talk about the effects of the housing crisis without talking about the other side, the people who are creating the conditions.
Sure.
In this time of out-of-control income disparity and extraction, which leads to the Twin Cities being ranked 4th first place Black Americans, in your view, who in the private sector has profited the most off of this housing crisis? And if you can be as explicit and specific as possible to Minneapolis, that would be helpful.
It's great. This is like my villains and heroes question, so thank you so much. Yes. So who's winning out of this mess?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that. I don't. I mean, and perhaps you've got a specific entity or a specific industry that has profited the most. I mean, certainly going into the crash of 2008, it was banks and financial institutions and mortgage fraud that was creating a whole lot of the mess. I'm not clear on it in terms of a dollar figure who has profited the most since then, though. I think that would be accurate, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just briefly add to that. I mean, I think we're a city that's more than 50% renter, and so just the bottom line is anyone who owns property in any community that has a shortage is profiting, is gaining and benefiting. And from there, of course, as the mayor mentioned, all the institutions that had invested and profited from the housing crisis, which explicitly exploited low-income people of color. And that continues. And now we're seeing the landlords in our community. We have, thousands and thousands of folks who own rental property. Many of them live in their, many of them are duplexes. They live in them. We have lots of folks who care about their tenants, but as an industry is very unregulated in a lot of ways, and there's very little protection for renters in Minnesota in particular.
Right. I have an answer for you, but I'll wait. Oh, yes, right here, yes. Thank you.
So you all are here because of the 2040 plan that kind of gives a focus to Minneapolis. One of my problems with the 2040 plan is that it's like the family who has a plan to build an addition to their house and do all manner of good things, but doesn't have the money to do it. This discussion is fundamentally about money and where it goes. So there's $40 million coming in. That's a drop in the bucket. The federal money isn't coming anytime soon. And changing people's income from $12 an hour to $15 is not going to solve anything. So I want to know where the plan in Minneapolis is coming from to have major money come into the city so we can afford all this stuff.
Good question. Where does the money come from to pay for the plan?
The money is coming from a variety of so, first let me say, if the argument is that $40 million in city investment coupled with the state and federal tax credits that we're getting, coupled with all of the other work from $15 an hour to earn sick and safe time to our 2040 comprehensive plan, if you're arguing that that is not enough to correct some of the injustices, you're right. You won't find any argument from us there. We haven't reached that point yet. But does a difficulty in reaching the ultimate goal, does that inhibit us from doing the work to get there? No, we still have to be trudging along that path down the road to ultimately get some sort of conclusion that quite simply helps people, because that's what government does. And I am proud that, the things that we, mayor and city council have done over the last several years, they are going to make a difference. And they were tough, and a lot of them are controversial, but they are going to make a difference. And I think that if we can kind of set the tone, if we can kind of be that beacon of inclusivity and hope and opportunity, hopefully we see much of the rest of the country follow along.
And we're
right at the end. I apologize, we're right at the end. So
we cannot accept as a reality that all of the pressure of disinvestment falls to cities. We cannot accept as a reality that states and the federal government are going to walk away from housing and other public investment. We are taxing low-income renters to reinvest in our community. We're maxing out on how much we can really gather from local property taxes, which is the major tool that we have. So we have to demand more from state and federal government.
And that's exactly right.
Where is the economic development plan for the city of Minneapolis?
So we have an economic development plan through the city of Minneapolis, both through community planning and economic development department, and we have another person that does that work in my office. And we are seeing the economy grow substantially. The economy right now in Minneapolis and actually in the region is not doing badly. In fact, we are creating way more jobs than we have people to fill them. The most recent statistic showed that we had somewhere in the range of 160,000 job vacancies in the Twin Cities region, and so we have the jobs, the economy is growing, the money is coming in, but as was pointed out, property taxes, which is a regressive form of taxation, can't be the exclusive tool from which we use resources.
So I need to bring it there. I just want to say, you raised a very important question for the camera did not hear it. You asked about where's the economic development plan to go with Minneapolis. I think it's a legitimate, interesting question. Yeah. To this gentleman over here, I just want to say in my chairman role of this, we've got to end this, unfortunately, right now. I would go back to the 08-09 financial crisis, which has come up, and one of the missed opportunities that I've written about at the Hill and elsewhere is at that moment when people were being moved out of their homes because of foreclosures, there was an incredible public policy failure there. That there were ways to work with financial institutions, there were ways to adjust policy rules to keep people in their homes, and at that moment, we had heard both from minority leader, from a lot of people, there was a policy failure. This is now recovering from that. I want to thank you both for spending time with us, Mayor, Madam President. Thank you so much for joining us this morning here in your city, and good luck with the projects.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Council President Bender and Mayor Frye. Pleasure to have you both with us this Monday morning. We're doing a little bit of redecorating for the great panel we have up next, so just bear with us for a moment. For more on efforts throughout the region to ensure housing accessibility and access for tenants and homeowners, we turn to our panel of experts. First up, Ellen Salih, President of Family Housing Fund, an organization working to build a strong housing system that allows people, communities, and regions to prosper. Ms. Salih joined the Family Housing Fund as president in 2015. Welcome. Lisa McDonald, founding member and organizer of the MinneapolisForEveryone.org, a group funded in 2017 to disseminate information and lobby on the Minneapolis 2040 Comprehensive Plan. McDonald served as 10th Ward Minneapolis City Council member from 1993 to 2001. Kathy Bennett, Director of Advisory Service and Product Councils with the Urban Land Institute of Minnesota. Ms. Bennett has over 30 years of experience in the community, and her work focuses on tools and strategies in cities to provide a full range of housing choices. And Margaret Kaplan, President of the Housing Justice Center, which works to encourage the production of affordable housing, the preservation of affordable housing, and the protection of the rights of people who need affordable places to call home. Joining these great ladies on stage is Jessica Lee, a local government reporter with MinPost, who will moderate this conversation. Thank you all and welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having us. So yes, I work for what's called MinPost, a nonprofit newsroom based here in Minneapolis, and I focus on housing and transit with my reporting. And I'm eager to hear what our panelists have to say about some of the issues that came up with the speakers earlier this morning. So first, before we get going, I would like to learn a little bit more about the perspective that you're coming from, the expertise that you're sharing that maybe wasn't a part of the conversation earlier today. Would you like to start? Okay.
Sure, why not? Hi, and first of all, thank you so much for allowing me to be here. Housing Justice Center, as I mentioned, is focused on the production, preservation, and protection of folks in affordable housing. Our perspective is really coming from both a fair housing standpoint, so we do legal and policy advocacy, and we also have a pretty deep focus on affordability. So really focusing primarily our efforts on households who are making less than about $30,000 a year, because that's the area where we're seeing the deepest need. So in terms of the way that we interact with this conversation, we really want to think about it as, how can we be doing more, and how can we have a more transformative approach to thinking about the history of land ownership and who benefits and who's burdened by the decisions that are being made.
Great. Kathy?
Yeah, Urban Land Institute, Minnesota, we're really a trusted convener, and our sweet spot is between conversations and coming to solutions between the public and private sectors. And we do this through the support that we provide through the Regional Council of Mayors, which has grown from 8 mayors in 2004 to over 60 mayors currently. And they come together on a monthly basis really to try to develop solutions together. And that's really the area that we support in this full range of housing choices, but also the really important connection between jobs, housing, and transportation. That's kind of the 3 pillars that we focus on to build sustainable communities.
Great. Lisa?
Minneapolis for Everyone started when the 2040 plan first started to progress. We felt it was a massive experiment without really any statistical evidence it was going to work. But now that we have it, one of the things that we're focused on is how do we make sure that the racial equity things get implemented, that what we're seeing right now is that developers have been given carte blanche in the city of Minneapolis, and so we're not getting a lot of affordable, which was what we were told we would get, but we will get a lot of density, but it will be mostly market rate, and they are developing in areas of the city that already would have had development. But the north side of town, which is where more of our African American and immigrant community is not, they're not going there. So that's one issue. Secondly is that we think we need more deeply affordable, 30 to 50%, and that's our focus. But I think the biggest issue is the issue of home ownership. Home ownership is a way that people, particularly people of color, low income immigrants, really create real generational wealth. And both Councilmember Bender and our planning director, Heather Worthington, have said that we're not addressing home ownership in this plan because we don't believe that it actually does create generational wealth. But when you have 76% of the white community in 2015 owning homes and only, I think it's 34% of the people of color owning homes, clearly it's an issue. And it is how you build stability in your neighborhoods, and it's also how I think you let families create generational wealth and send their kids to college, etc. So this is a racial equity plan. It's really falling down on a very pivotal portion, which is home ownership.
Thank you. Ellen?
Hi, thank you. I'm Ellen Solly with the Family Housing Fund. And the Family Housing Fund works in the 7-county metro area to help communities address their housing challenge. So we work to increase housing supply by new development as well as preservation of existing housing. But second, we also work very hard to increase access and opportunity to make sure that low-income families and people who need access to the units has a uniform and fair way to access those units.
Great. All right, so I know it's been mentioned a few times, both in this conversation and also earlier today, Minneapolis 2040. Minneapolis made national headlines, as I'm sure most of us know, about eliminating single-family zoning, the first major city to do so. What does that really mean within this broader picture of a shortage of affordable housing? That's question number one. Question number two, what are some of the suburban areas doing in terms of increasing density or not even really considering more density to fill this gap?
Well, you know, I think it's interesting. When I think about this issue of density and affordability in the context of the 2040 plan, I think about density as being necessary but insufficient to create affordability. And I will say, you know, there is a tendency, and I think specifically in the national media, to really kind of blow up what Minneapolis is saying they're trying to do with 2040. I don't think anybody in the city of Minneapolis is saying, well, gosh darn it, we've solved affordability through triplexes. However, we have done some research that shows that, you know, one of the cost drivers for building affordable housing is time and density. So these are really important. However, there are challenges with that. If you do the density without regulation that's going to drive affordability, you're not likely to get as much as you can if you're really putting in some systems and controls. The other thing is, you know, land ownership is what it is, and changing the zoning doesn't change that there are decades and centuries of people benefiting from the way land ownership is operated in this country. So we have to be ready to have some pretty transformative discussions about who owns land and who's benefited from this historically, and what do we do in order to change this. The suburbs are doing some pretty innovative things, I would say, just in terms of trying to encourage more affordability and more density, particularly some of their approaches to inclusionary zoning policies. That's also a conversation that's been happening pretty actively in Minneapolis as well, too. So it's good to see these things sort of growing and changing and communities learning from each other, but we're not going nearly far enough.
Sure. So inclusionary zoning is a rule that would mandate developers to include a portion of their developments to units that are below market rate rent levels. And Minneapolis is in the process of finalizing what that zoning code would look like. Developers have a pretty organized effort against the change, saying that it would really hurt their bottom line. Do we have anything else to add on this density question in the suburbs and Minneapolis 2040 in a broader context?
Yeah, I can speak about the suburbs. That's mostly the work that we do with our Regional Council of Mayors is in the suburbs. And we've seen a significant shift from the work that we started 10, 12 years ago, where you could not even really talk about affordable housing, to now the majority of the communities where we've done work in, 80 plus conversations around the metro area, has been how do we get affordability, and the understanding that for them to be economically competitive that they need to support affordable housing. And so we've seen a lot of different cities really taking a leadership role in upping their game with regards to adding more tools to their toolbox, as well as incorporating the support of affordability in new development, and modifying their codes around tenant protections for preservation. So there's just been a lot of work done in the suburbs. And the one thing I want to mention, there's this new term that was coined out of the ULI National Urban Trends Report in 2020, is hipstervia. And that really is the migration now of the millennials moving from the great things that they loved about Minneapolis and the density in Minneapolis to suburban locations where now cities are creating these live, work, and play locations. And they're really supporting added density with new housing in shopping centers such as Ridgedale, reinventing the downtown neighborhoods in Hopkins and Robbinsdale, and then creating these new live-work places like West End. So there's a lot going on in the suburbs around housing affordability, and density.
Just two things I want to touch on that. One is in the suburbs, we've noticed that in their inclusionary housing plans, a lot of folks have chosen to buy in. They pay a fee as opposed to doing the building, particularly in Edina. But I think just the interim inclusionary housing policy the city had, which this new policy will replace, basically it didn't really generate, I think it generated 7 units. And there's a lot of hoops, et cetera, to jump through. And it'll be very interesting to see if the second inclusionary housing policy actually produces the types of things. And of course, it's closer to market rate. It's 60 to 80. It's not the deeply affordable. The other thing I want to point out is that the whole triplex issue, which everyone has talked about. Oh, everyone can go build a triplex and they can own it and they can make money and then they'll build some wealth. The problem with that is that the entrance to the market in terms of house price is the same price that triplex developers are in. And so if you want to buy that house, but someone wants to build a triplex there, they're going to beat you to it as a homeowner. And so, and then they're going to demo it, and they're going to build a market rate triplex. So once again, we're not really creating the real types of housing that we want to have in the city.
I think it's really important to remember how much of a housing shortage we have. So anything that increases supply is an important first step. It's not the only one, but we do need to ensure we are building enough housing to meet the demand. Earlier panelists talked about the housing shortage. We know that we have underbuilt in our region, and every year that we are underbuilding, while simultaneously having an increase in population, exacerbates our housing challenge. We have underbuilt and we are growing. That is a recipe for a region that quickly could become not competitive if we don't respond. And we've done some research that talked about the importance of being able to respond in order to continue to support that growth in the region, that fuels the state, and makes our economy strong.
Sure, very great points. Something that was mentioned was this push towards strengthening protections for tenants. It's been said that both Minneapolis and St. Paul have a renter majority now, and we've seen a wave of policies, specifically in Minneapolis, to number one, change the screening application process for renters and also cap security deposits. We've also heard talk of rent control or rent stabilization. Let's unpack what this moment means in terms of policymaking here in the Twin Cities.
I think that we need to be thinking about this tenant protection, these policies. We need to be thinking about them not just in Minneapolis and St. Paul. We need to be thinking about them on a state level. We need to be thinking about them in suburban communities as well. And there are some real opportunities right now to be thinking about issues like rent stabilization, tenant opportunity to purchase. So this opportunity for folks who are paying the bills in rental housing to have decision-making powers when things are going to be changing with their housing. This is absolutely critical as well, too. Issues related to zoning reform and ownership reform, just cause, making sure that people can't be non-renewed from their rental housing because a landlord has decided that they just want somebody else there, or they want to do something different with that property with no recourse for the people who are living there. So I think these are really important discussions to have, especially as we're experiencing mass displacement all over the metro area.
adding on to that, housing stability is an important feature. We need to support families to maintain this housing that they have. We are doing a lot of work in eviction prevention because we know that we can do more to support families that are in crisis to maintain that housing. So while that might not be called tenant protection, it's an important element of ensuring an overall stable housing market for those that are relying on rental housing as their housing choice.
Sure.
And I would say added to that, certainly the tenant protections and all of those efforts are really important. And also what we hear from our mayors is the preservation of their natural occurring affordable housing and what tools can they access to help facilitate that. They want to see the older housing in their community as quality as possible. Also, they don't want to see their residents displaced, but in many suburban communities, they feel like they have limited resource to do that. So all of these conversations help them to become smarter, help them to kind of learn about the different tools and strategies that are working in other locations, and that is going to help the region overall in the long run.
Great points. Thank you. Thank you all. So now we have some time for some audience questions. Yes, right here. I think we have someone with the mic.
Yes, thank you for being here. Thanks for taking my question. I work with an organization called Mobile Homes and Fishes, and we make sandwiches and different hot meals for the homeless. And we put them on a truck and we bring them around to the homeless people. And the gentleman before said, who's benefiting the most from the recent housing problem? And that couldn't be answered. But I will tell you, from my experience, who's benefiting the least are the homeless. And as we go around, we see now, because we also work with helping people get into homes. Many have gotten into homes and becoming into rental homes and are becoming stable with resources. But now, in the areas particularly where the multiplex units are going up, the rents are also going to be going up.
Well, should we ask this panel what they think in terms of who's benefiting?
Well, I just want to say that this is not going to happen until March. And I will back that up by saying, if you look at a national survey where the rental units prices, the fair market rental price in Minnesota and Minneapolis particularly, is going up faster than anywhere else in the nation. So we want to know what, I know you said you're going to try to stabilize the rent control people, but it's really not happening, and a lot of places are just raising the rent. So let's remember the homeless and maybe build some housing, because they're going to double in size in March if all these people are put out of their homes. Thank you.
Sure. So finding a question within that, let's have this panel answer who they think is profiting off of this shortage that we have. I know the mayor and Lisa Bender was asked that question.
I don't think anybody is profiting. I mean, I think it's a crisis around the whole entire spectrum. I mean, you may think that developers are profiting, corporations are profiting, but they have to make money to stay in business. And it's the responsibility of all to really come together as a partnership to try to help develop solutions. And that does mean, yes, that developers need to be at the table and take responsibility. The state needs to be there, the federal government, the local community, residents and individuals, as well as corporations. I think it takes everyone to help solve this problem.
I disagree. I think that there are people who are profiting off of the current situation. You know, the history of land ownership, once again, people who've had the opportunity to own land and control what is happening with land are profiting. Developers, for-profit developers, are profiting. And we see every day, as we're working with people who are experiencing unjustifiably high rents and fees that, quite frankly, are illegal, that there are people who are getting absolutely milked for every dime from their current landlords. So somebody is profiting off of this. I do agree, though, that there are ways that we can work together across sectors, and I also think we can have that conversation in a really powerful and effective way, including a broad trajectory, a broad range of people with a bunch of different perspectives as well, too, from people who have the most transformative ideas about what the future of home and land ownership is going to be, to folks who are really central to our current conversations about housing.
And to clarify, Margaret, I'm not saying that developers are not profiting and landlords are not profiting, but if we don't solve this solution together, nobody's going to be profiting. That's the point that I was trying to make.
I would agree that in Minneapolis, I think because of the way 2040 has been structured, in terms of taking off all the rules, any kind of zoning, gives developers carte blanche. Well, the problem is what's happened here is that we've had many developers come nationally into Minneapolis because they're like, boy howdy, this is going to be great. You know, we're going to make some money. And clearly most of them are building market rate and above. So we know that that's what they were thinking. Well, the problem with that is that you give them the power to eventually build what they want. It doesn't necessarily increase the amount of housing stock we have. And when the economy changes, they leave. Whereas if the city had put a little bit more structure to this in terms of what they could build and what they can't build and where we want it, instead of just saying whatever, we would have been able to say, yes, we're seeing some increases, or we're getting the kind of housing we want here. We're going to get some actual more housing units. I don't think the inclusionary housing policy will provide very many units over the course of its life.
I would say, I would say, though, that I don't think what we're experiencing today is a consequence of the 2040 plan. The 2040 plan, I mean, the zoning changes just happened. So I think the jury's still out in terms of what the consequences of that are going to be. If anything, I think the 2040 plan doesn't go far enough in terms of allowing density, but we do need to have better ways for people to participate, particularly from disinvested communities in decision making.
So the one thing that I would add to this conversation is I think housing is a national issue. You can hardly pick up a newspaper without seeing housing as a crisis across this country, and our region is in the same position. What I think provides an opportunity there is to develop more tools, new tools, more resources, more support to tackle this issue, to respond in a way that reflects that it is a crisis. And so while it's an important question to ask who is profiting, I think another way of thinking about it is what can we do with the increased attention to come up with real solutions that advance and solve this problem for all of the individuals on the economic spectrum, that responds in a way that represents who we are as a community.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives this morning. On that note, we are done. The panelists, I believe, will be hanging out for a few minutes if you have further questions to ask them, but thank you so much for having us.
All right. Thank you, Jessica, our panelists, and all of our distinguished speakers here this morning for having such a great conversation. On behalf of everyone at the Hill and our underwriter, the National Association of Home Builders, we thank everyone in the room and those who tuned in to the live stream and joining us this morning. If you missed any portion of today's discussion, the full event video will be available on thehill.com shortly. We encourage everyone to keep the conversation going on social media using the hashtag #TheHillBuildingTheDream and tagging us at The Hill Events. Be sure to keep up with the rest of the Building the Dream series and our other event programs. As a reminder, please be sure to complete your electronic survey that will be sent to you later today. Thank you again for being with us this morning, and enjoy the rest of your day.